There is a hush that comes over the night when the last neighborhood light fades and the sky remembers its older language. A lattice of stars cross-stitching the dark, like scattered embers cooled by enormous distances. And beneath that glow, hidden in the seeming fullness, lie hollows so immense that they dwarf galaxies and swallow clusters in a silence deeper than myth, inviting us to lean in and listen for what nothingness might be saying. In astronomy, they are called voids, but the word is too small for their reach, too simple for the way they open like lakes of dusk in the map of everything. And of these hollows, one has become a kind of legend, a desert in a universe of oases, a cavern in the honeycomb of space, known as the Boötes Void, an expanse so bare that discovering it felt like hearing a pause in a symphony that should never pause, an absence that keeps unfolding as you stare into it. Imagine measuring the cosmos the way cartographers once traced coastlines, stepping along one redshift after another, and finding not a bustling metropolis of galaxies, but a plain, a vacancy hundreds of millions of light years across, with only a handful of scattered islands afloat, as if some tidal force had drawn matter away and left behind a glassy sea whose surface refuses to ripple, a silence that makes you wonder whether silence itself has contours. The modern picture of matter is a web, a vast filigree of filaments braided by gravity, galaxies beating along like dew, clusters thickening at the knots. And in between these strands, the voids widen, not truly empty, yet weightless compared to their embanked surroundings, expanding faster, cooling the mood of space, letting light pass with only the faintest change of pitch, as if the universe were humming a note that's lower in the hollows and higher on the walls. Such emptiness is not a void in the absolute sense, but a thinning, a decrease in crowding, a region where gravity's handshake loosens, and everything drifts just a little freer. And while the name sounds cold, there is a strange warmth in the idea that absence can have shape, that nothing can possess architecture, that the indifference between galaxies is itself a structure we can chart and imagine, as if we were architects of a cathedral built from the spaces between stones. When astronomers first saw the Boötes Void in survey slices, it looked like a bubble risen from ancient depths, a circle clear of clutter, a pocket in the foam as if someone had held a breath under space and never let it go. And the question followed like a shadow. Are such hollows accidents of random rippling, or hints of something that once passed through the cosmos, like a wind that organized dust into dunes and left behind a geometry of rest? Stand on the edge of a void in your mind and look inward, and you can sense the way gravity shapes the borderlands, how galaxies on the rim feel a gentle push from behind, how flows of matter stream toward denser filaments, as if the empty were repelling by merely not attracting, and how that absence can tug faintly on the path of light, unsorting the scattered photons in ways our instruments can barely catch, like fingerprints left by gloves. To map a void is to accept that the map is mostly white, that the feature itself is a lack of features. And yet, within the blankness, small sparks appear, solitary galaxies that evolved far from the city's blaze. Blue, gas-rich, oddly isolated, living a slower clock and forming stars like embers that refuse to die, tiny hearths in a wilderness. And the presence of these outliers tells us the desert is a habitat too, and habitats have histories that need listening. Beyond the practical, voids touch something older in us, something that feared falling into a sky with no bottom, the dread of vacuum that haunted philosophers, and yet also the quiet that monastics seek, a wide-open unfilledness that suggests potential, like a canvas before paint, or a stage just after the curtain rises. And in that tension between fear and awe, the cosmos keeps placing these chasms, as if to test our appetite for wondering about absence. The pattern stretches across the observable universe, like a lace thrown over a lantern. And the holes in the lace are as important as the threads. Because their breadth lets the expansion breathe, their scale frames the glowing walls, and their subtle influence reaches even into the background light left from the beginning. Hints of coolness stitched into the microwave afterglow, whispers that somewhere deep a basin has slowed time by a fraction and left a mark like a thumbprint on ancient glass. We map, we measure, we name. And yet when we stare into a void like boats, some part of us hears something else. Not the recession velocity or the density contrast, but the suggestion that emptiness is not passive, that it collaborates with gravity to write the script of structure. And behind that suggestion lies another, the sense that every map has edges, and every edge oversees a distance that refuses to be fully counted, like a horizon that moves when you approach it. In that shifting distance, in those hollows where galaxies thin out and thought unfurls, mysteries gather like dew. And if a pause in the music can change the mood of the song, then perhaps a pause in the matter changes the mood of the cosmos, opening not just space, but questions. And it is toward those questions that we drift now, toward the histories and anomalies that make the emptiness feel less like a desert and more like a clue we have not yet learned to read. Long before telescopes learned to pour the sky into spectra, people faced the night and named its blackness, giving the blank places personalities and powers, calling the first waters none, the primordial ocean that held creation in Egypt's oldest hymns, or chaos for the Greeks, a yawning void that was not disorder but an opening, while in India, the word shunya rested on the tongue like a soft zero. And in the folds of Buddhist thought, emptiness was not negation, but a spaciousness so complete it could cradle everything. Taoist texts speak of Su and Wu, the uncarved block and the potent empty that makes the hub of the wheel useful. And in the Kabbalistic teaching of Tzimtzum, the divine withdraws to make room for the world, a sacred contraction that bursts a theater out of vacancy. And whether allegory or intuition, these old metaphors sketch a blueprint of hollows with rolls, as if somewhere behind the sky there is a grammar where absence acts, and it is hard not to feel that grammar echo in the cosmic web. For centuries, the West wrestled with the question of vacuum, the horror vacui of Aristotle, refusing a void as unnatural, until barometers and mercury columns drew a sliver of emptiness in glass and made absence into a measurable state. And in the centuries that followed, the ether was invented and then dismissed, and the vacuum became a stage for quantum fields chattering in the dark, a foaming sea of fluctuations beneath the calm, a reminder that even where there is almost nothing, there is a kind of murmur. Meanwhile, the early cartographers of the universe counted nebulae and learned they were other islands of stars, and the distances exploded, and the expansions settled into the story like a plot twist that felt inevitable. And as surveys deepened, patterns appeared like the grain in wood, walls and groups and filaments, while in the 1970s, theorists traced pancakes and foam in their pencils and wondered if gravity would braid the primordial ripples into a lattice with emptiness swelling between strands. Then came the fruit of patient mapping, thin slices through the northern sky like cuts through a sponge cake, revealing a surprising texture. And one of those cuts ran through the constellation of the herdsman and showed a misplaced quiet, a circle where galaxies were scarce, a sphere of fewer lights, and the name that attached to it carried an air of discovery and doubt, because to find a desert that large in the middle of what was presumed fertile is to wonder whether one has stumbled upon a mirage or a message. The Boötes Void, once charted, reshaped imaginations, and soon astronomers saw the universe not as a uniform fog peppered with lights, but as a bubbled foam where the bubbles were the main event, voids tens of millions of light years across, some merging into supervoids that span hundreds, their borders dressed in clusters like shoreline towns, their centers sparsely seeded with lone galaxies whose blue light testifies to slow, steady lives, as if they had found a way to grow old without the bustle of neighbors. These island galaxies inside hollows fascinate by mere persistence, their gas reservoirs unharassed, their spiral arms unworried by tides, their starbirth more a drizzle than a storm, and the isolation seems to write a different biography for them, a story told in whispers rather than shouts. And those biographies spill a hint that the deserts are not dead, but simply choose a different tempo, a cadence only the patient ear detects when the wind of the cosmic web quiets. When one draws the map and lingers on the blank spaces, a cultural memory rises, the old habit of inscribing unknown margins with monsters and warnings. And while the modern atlas of galaxies draws no serpents, it does carry ellipses and edges where our data thins and our assumptions thicken. And in those places conjecture grows like vines, climbing toward explanations that range from sober to strange. Because whenever the chart fades, imagination fills the white with stories. The edges are also temporal, because light from the farthest emptiness is ancient, and every void is a fossil of an initial lull, an underdensity that expansion magnified, and the physics of their growth is almost serene. Where there was slightly less gravity, space stretched slightly faster, and over billions of years, the hollows widened like breath slowly released. A calm mechanic that nonetheless leaves room for oddities. Regions that appear a bit too clean, a bit too cool, a bit too aligned with features we did not expect. That word cool is not metaphor alone, because the radiation that bathes the cosmos, a whisper from the first light after the fireball settled, shows tiny variations in temperature, 1 in 100,000. And amid that speckled speckle, there are patches that depart more gravely. And as void maps and microwave maps were laid atop one another, some swore that a remarkable patch of cold tangled with a remarkable stretch of empty, as if space and its memory were nodding in agreement. The suspicion drew eyes to a region in the southern skies where the river Eridanus runs in myth. And there the microwave glow dips below its neighbors more than statistics seem to permit. A cold spot that may be a coincidence or a relic, or a signpost to a larger story. And when galaxy counts along that line show a dearth, the possibility arises that a supervoid could imprint its weightlessness on the ancient light, a faint chill carried forward, like a rumor through time, between myth and instrument, between ancient fears of nothing and modern indulgences in mapping it. A theme emerges like a basso continuo under a composition. Emptiness is not just background but agency, and whether as metaphor or metric, it shapes what follows. And as we listen closer to the cold spots and the thin places in the galaxy census, we realize that the desert might not only be where little happens, but where the simplest happenings speak the loudest, asking us to lean closer still. The oldest light we can see arrives as a soft hiss, a perfect black body turned almost perfect by tiny modelings. The cosmic microwave background that fell across detectors like confetti from a celebration that ended 13.8 billion years ago. And within that confetti, most pieces are ordinary, ripples that seeded galaxies, but one region stands out like a pond colder than the stream, an eccentric patch of sky that seems to shiver more than the theory prefers. And this shiver has become a lantern for many kinds of hunters. In the constellations of southern skies lies an expanse where the temperature dips by a few tens of microkelvin more than the average undulation. A cold spot measured by satellites built for quiet and care, first by WMAP and then with greater precision by Planck. And the significance of the deviation has been weighed and reweighed, stacked against simulations, both generous and stern. And while debates remain about the exact odds, the persistence of the feature invites attention like a knot in wood that your fingers keep finding. One explanation is elegantly mundane. Along the line of sight sits an extended underdensity, a supervoid in the direction of Eridanus, not empty but thinner than its surroundings over hundreds of millions of light years. And as the ancient light climbs out of that broad depression, the changing cosmic expansion leaves it slightly less energetic. A late-time integrated Sachs-Wolf effect, a thermal sigh imprinted by the universe's accelerating stretch, a whisper that says even emptiness has weather. But when surveys scoured that corridor and measured the void's depth and width, a gentle mismatch appeared, because the expected chill from such an underdensity seems too small to explain the entire shiver, leaving a residue of strangeness that arithmetic cannot easily absorb. And into that residue flow other ideas, some conservative and some wild, possibilities that the cold spot is a statistical fluke wearing a mask of importance, or a wound from an early texture in the gravitational field, or a collision with another bubble of reality in an inflationary multiverse that only brushed ours. Textures are relics from broken symmetries, topological knots that could have formed as the infant universe cooled and its field settled. And a cosmic texture could lens and shift the background photons in a way that resembles the observed chill, while a bubble collision paints an even broader canvas, a bruise left by a neighboring vacuum patch that once met our own, stories that stretch credulity and yet remain mathematically embroidered into some models of the early fire, leaving us torn between caution and curiosity. What muddies the water further is the sky's habit of aligning its oddities. Low multipoles in the microwave map pointing toward a strange common orientation. Some have nicknamed the axis of evil, a theatrical label for a subtle pattern that could be noise, or could be an artifact of foregrounds, or could be a hint that space is not entirely isotropic at the largest scales. And into that possibility march other alignments, like strings of quasar polarizations that seem to point in concert across billions of light years. A chorus that might be a mirage or a message. Throughout, the role of voids persists like a steady drumbeat, because even if the cold spot's full story is not a supervoid, many smaller voids collectively demonstrate their influence by cooling the background a touch as photons pass through their slackening depths, and stacking many of them reveals a signal consistent with the universe's accelerated expansion, suggesting that emptiness aids us in confirming the presence of dark energy by being precisely the kind of place where acceleration leaves a trace. The thought that nothing can speak by the way it fails to arrest is a poetic inversion, but also a calculation, because voids do more than cool light. They distort shapes faintly in reversive clusters, diminishing rather than magnifying, and their spherical or elliptical forms stretch under certain cosmologies, offering a geometric test of the cosmic recipe, a way to ask if general relativity holds the reins in the weakest fields, or if subtle deviations creep in, where gravity is thinnest and screening breaks down. On the human scale, emptiness is often a lack. On the cosmic scale, emptiness is a lens and a clock, and when a dataset as ancient as the microwave background acquires a bruise, emptiness is a suspect worth interrogating with care. And in that interrogation, we find ourselves measuring absence as if it were a substance, counting galaxies not present, tracking flows away from vacated regions, timing the faint cooling of photons on long climbs, all to answer a question that keeps stepping back as we approach. Even the conspiratorial whisper finds a foothold in such terrain, because maps with holes invite the thought that the simulation hard drives skipped a sector, that reality lost a packet in transmission, or that survey boundaries and observational biases carved clean lines into wilder shapes. And though the discipline reminds us to distrust seductive stories, the mind nonetheless wonders whether the neatness of certain void edges or the persistence of certain alignments suggests an architecture we have not quite admitted. Between sober models and speculative tailies, the voids keep doing their work, expanding into the spaces where their initial underdensities invite faster stretch, herding matter gently toward filaments, carving out quiet amphitheaters where loneliness changes how galaxies live, and touching the oldest light with faint signatures that add up when stacked, a series of small nudges that hint at the larger forces shaping the chorus we hear, a chorus whose drier notes may carry secrets our ears are only beginning to detect. If the cold spot turns out to be a coincidence lovingly dressed by our yearning, the voids remain, patient and vast, real and measurable. And if the cold spot carries a story deeper than statistics, the voids might be the syllables in which that story is told. A dictionary of absences we can consult when the sky writes in negative space, and as our instruments sharpen, it is in the hollows and along their rims that we may find the next sentence waiting to be read. In the language of structure formation, voids emerge from modest beginnings, from tiny dips in an otherwise smooth sea of primordial density, where quantum whispers inflated into classical ripples. And as gravity grasped the hills more firmly than the valleys, those valleys stretched, letting space inside them accelerate a touch faster, so that over eons the underdense regions became underdenser, their shells sweeping matter outward, until the empties seemed to push. Though it only lacked the pull that walls and knots exert with casual certainty, this graceful growth has a genealogy of its own, scholars tracing families of hollows that merge or are crushed, a void-in-void hierarchy where small basins combine into larger bowls, and a void-in-cloud fate where bigger neighbors compress the small until their identities blur. And out of these lines of descent, the cosmic foam takes shape, with membranes of galaxies draped over interfaces, and the soft centers expanding like lungs, a respiratory system for a universe whose breath we measure in megaparsecs. Because voids are gently governed, they offer a stage where alternative gravities could be less shy, where chameleon fields that hide in crowded regions might reveal themselves. In the shelved quiet of emptiness, even neutrinos murmur, their light masses smoothing small-scale ripples and altering the count and profile of voids, giving observers a new lever to weigh the sum of those masses by tallying the number of hollows at different sizes. And while the constraints are young, they are promises written in a gentle hand, a sign that absence can be a laboratory as precise as any dense cluster if we learn to calibrate our ears to the lower volume of its experiments. Light, too, reports differently from inside a void, its paths slightly unbent compared to its arcing near clusters, its images slightly demagnified and with sufficient background sources, and careful stacking surveys have detected this anti-lensing. A faint sigh in the shapes of distant galaxies that passes as proof of concept that even the thinnest places tug, and every tug is a dataset, every dataset a chance to test the expansionist pace and the growth of structure. S-tempo without relying solely on the loudest parts of the orchestra. Closer to home, emptiness is not an abstraction, but a neighbor, because our local group sits at the boundary of a lopsided landscape, where an underdensity to one side and overdense regions to another choreograph our motion, and reconstructions of the velocity field reveal a dipole repeller that seems to push by virtue of lacking pull, complementing the allure of attractors like Shapley farther out, so that our galaxy's drift through the cosmic sea is not only drawn toward lights, but also eased away from shadows. This dance of approaches and retreats, used to wear dramatic clothes under the name dark flow, a claim of coherent motions to far horizons that stirred imagination and skepticism in equal measure. And while the grandest versions of that claim faded under scrutiny, the nuanced picture remains that local voids and attractors sculpt our path, a quiet choreography suggesting that the shape of the nearby nothing matters, and that our address includes not just the filament we reside upon, but the hollow at whose shore we build our city of stars. Inside the desert, life persists in ways that rewrite expectations, with ring galaxies and faint dwarfs lingering in relative solitude their gas, unstripped their outskirts, unruffled their histories, slow burning like candles, protected from wind. And by studying these recluses, we glimpse what a galaxy might become if freed from the crowded politics of clusters, an alternate script written in widely spaced punctuation marks across a page sparsely inked by companions. All of these threads converge on a simple lesson wrapped in complicated data. Emptiness is a tool, and using it asks for patience and precision, because the signals are modest and the confounders many. Yet the reward is a handle on cosmic acceleration, gravity's law in its weakest theater, the masses of ghosts like neutrinos, and the map of our own motion through a swollen ocean of space, a satisfaction akin to learning the shape of a breeze by the drape of a curtain's hem. The next chapters in this work will be carved by instruments that see fainter galaxies, measure redshifts faster, chart hydrogen through static, and trace the silhouette of voids in thousands, where we now have hundreds. And it is tempting to imagine that the foam will look familiar under brighter lamps. Yet even familiarity will carry surprise, because the more you resolve a shoreline, the more bays and inlets appear, and the hollows of the universe are nothing if not coasts awaiting a more detailed tide chart. The desert remains ahead, the maps thickening, the physics inviting, and in the quiet between structures, there is a promise that the cleanest tests of our theories lie in the places we once ignored, the soft centers where space expands in slow astonishment, and to step into those centers with better eyes is to risk learning not just more of the same, but the one deviation that changes the tune. A deviation that could be hiding in the breath, between filaments, like a secret, waiting to be whispered when the night is very still. What comes next unfolds in glass and silicon and patience. A new generation of surveyors setting sail into the calm, their ships armed with wide fields and deep exposures, mapping billions of galaxies, and tracing the web with a fidelity we have only guessed. And as those maps fill, the white spaces where voids live will sharpen, their contours no longer rough circles, but complex basins, their statistics turning from coarse counts to exquisite distributions that capture the accents of emptiness like a recording of a soft voice played back at volume. One of the most ambitious voyages has begun with a space observatory tuned to the geometry of the universe, measuring shapes and redshifts with a steadiness that makes weak lensing legible. And as its catalogs grow, voids will materialize as anti-lenses and as distortions of clustering, giving a redundancy of tests for dark energy that complement the grand symphonies of supernova and acoustic oscillations. And in that complementarity lies a guard against being fooled by any one instrument's quirks. On the ground, a telescope will soon sweep the entire sky every few nights, building a time-lapse of the deep that catches transients and slowly resolves structure with a vaster census. And from these repeated passes, a three-dimensional picture of the cosmic web will thicken, revealing voids at many distances, allowing us to watch how their shapes evolve with redshift, how they align with each other, and how their galactic inhabitants trace different lifelines than their cousins in denser towns. Other eyes will tune to hydrogen's whisper, measuring neutral gas across cosmic time. And in those maps, the universe at its adolescence will appear as a quilt of ionized bubbles in neutral valleys, reionization advancing like sunrise across fog. And the first true voids of that era will be not just underdense of matter, but underbright of the earliest stars, offering a laboratory for how structure first learned to carve shadows, a storytelling that turns voids into pages on which the dawn of starlight wrote its marginalia. At the same time, a mission with spectrometers designed to catalog the sky's colors in meticulous array will measure redshifts in bulk, enabling void catalogs so rich that statistical questions soften. And in the cross-correlation of those voids, with the microwave background, the late-time cold imprint will be measured with a confidence that escapes current arguments, potentially transforming a debated curiosity into a robust yardstick, or revealing that something else must be invited into the equation to reconcile stubborn numbers. There are subtler frontiers too. Ideas like using void galaxy cross-correlations to sharpen the baryon acoustic signal, or employing the spherical symmetry of well-defined voids to perform Alcock-Paczynski tests free from some biases, or watching for a tiny gravitational redshift in void environments that would verify general relativity's predictions in a new regime. And although each seems like a whisper within a whisper, together they form a choir of constraints that can quiet doubt or raise it with precision. Beyond the measurements lies a philosophical return to an old thought, that creation is not just what appears, but remains absent. That structure is the negative of emptiness, and emptiness the negative of structure. And in the language of mystics, this was once rendered as a withdrawal that makes room, while in the language of cosmology, it is a slight initial lull magnified by expansion. Yet in both stories, the hollow is not an error but a necessity, and our role is to learn to read the necessity script with empathy and rigor. Perhaps the conspiracies will weaken as data strengthens, their allure dimming as edges grow ragged and alignments fall back into statistical comfort. Or perhaps one or two will endure and force revisions. An axis that refuses to pivot to random, a cold spot that remains too insistent, a void whose cleanliness exceeds the best simulations. And in that endurance, the quiet will grow louder, pushing us to look beyond the usual suspects and entertain possibilities we keep on the shelf labeled maybe. Stand again at the rim of the boat's void in your imagination. A sea of subdued gravity stretching out and away, small lights dotting the interior like lantern boats adrift, the walls far and curved, and feel the stillness seep into your breathing, as if the cosmos were inviting you to match its slower rhythm. To understand that most of space is not crowded drama, but an art of understatement, and that in understatement lies both rest and revelation, if we have the patience to attend. The deeper we map, the more the universe looks like lace, and the lace is defined as much by its holes as by its threads. A craft that takes time and steadiness of hand, and what is most tender is that we, small and local, have learned to measure the vast and vacant, to give names to places where there are almost no things, to find meaning in the way photons cool and shapes shrink by a whisper, and to let those whispers change our biggest answers without ever raising their voice. The voyage continues, along filaments and through hollows, amid data releases and revisions, among theories that harden and soften as they encounter new light, and the voids remain companions on this wander, quiet guides whose very reticence invites us to slow down and hear what the universe says when it stops speaking loudly. And in that listening, there is a comfort suited for nights when the mind needs a wide horizon to rest upon without closing its eyes entirely. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.